You don't meet people as they are. You meet them through what your mind already understands. Not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically. Before you fully register who someone is, your mind has already started asking a different question. What does this person remind me of? The mind is not designed to experience people from a neutral position. It is designed to predict, to reduce uncertainty, to move quickly from the unknown into something familiar. So instead of meeting someone as a completely new presence, your mind searches for patterns it has already seen. A tone of voice that feels similar, a way of speaking that resembles someone else, a kind of attention, or lack of it, that echoes something older. These details seem small, almost insignificant, but to the mind, they are enough. Enough to begin mapping the person in front of you onto someone from your past. And once that mapping begins, the interaction is no longer happening in the present alone. It is being filtered through memory. You are not just seeing this person, you are seeing what they resemble. If someone speaks in a way that reminds you of someone who once dismissed you, your mind does not treat that similarity as neutral. It treats it as a signal. A signal that this interaction might lead to the same outcome. So before anything significant has even happened, a quiet expectation forms. Not spoken, not examined, but felt. This might end the way it did before. The other person may be entirely different, different intentions, different awareness, different way of relating. But the mind does not begin there. It begins with what it already knows. This is why first impressions feel so immediate, so certain, so difficult to question. Because they are not built only from what is in front of you. They are built from what has already happened to you. Your mind fills in the unknown with what it remembers. And memory does not return as memory. It returns as interpretation, as a quiet sense of knowing, as a feeling that something about this person is already clear, even when it isn't. From that point forward, you begin relating to them through that interpretation. Your tone adjusts, your attention shifts. Your responses begin aligning with an expectation that was never fully examined. And the other person feels it, even if they don't understand it, because they are being responded to, not only as themselves, but as a reflection of someone they have never been. This is where familiarity quietly replaces reality, before the person in front of you has had the chance to exist on their own. You don't wait to understand someone. You begin expecting them. Once your mind recognizes something familiar, it doesn't stay neutral. It moves ahead. It starts predicting what this person will do next, how they will respond, what they will eventually reveal. And those predictions feel subtle, almost invisible, but they begin shaping the way you experience every small detail. A delayed response no longer feels random, it fits into a pattern. A shift in tone no longer feels neutral, it begins to confirm something. The mind connects these small signals to the expectation it already formed, and each connection makes that expectation feel more accurate. But the expectation did not come from this person. It came from what your mind remembers, from people who acted a certain way before, from moments that ended in a certain pattern, from outcomes your mind is trying to avoid repeating. So instead of observing who this person actually is, you begin interpreting them through what you believe they might become, and that belief quietly changes your behavior. You might become more guarded, more cautious, more reactive to small changes. You might read deeper into things that were never meant to carry that weight, not because the moment demands it, but because your expectation already prepared you for it. The other person does not see the expectation forming. They only feel the result of it, a slight distance, a shift in energy, a reaction that seems stronger than the moment requires. And they begin adjusting too. This is where expectation starts shaping reality, not in an obvious way, but through small, repeated responses. The way you interpret their silence, the way you respond to their tone, the way you anticipate their behavior before it fully appears. And over time, those expectations begin guiding the interaction. You start responding to what you think is coming, instead of what is actually happening, which changes the way the other person responds back. They may become more distant because you became guarded. They may become less expressive because you became uncertain. They may pull back because something in your response signaled tension. And when that happens, your mind recognizes it immediately, not as something new, but as confirmation. This is exactly what I expected. And that confirmation feels like proof. Proof that your original interpretation was correct. Proof that your expectation was justified. But what often goes unseen is how your expectation helped shape the very behavior you are now reacting to. The mind believes it predicted the outcome, when in reality, it quietly participated in creating it. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. At some point, you stop responding to the person and start responding to the pattern. The shift is subtle. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like clarity. Like you've figured something out about them. But what you've actually recognized is something from before. Once the mind links someone to a familiar pattern, it begins treating that pattern as the reference point. Not the person in front of you, the pattern. And patterns come with expectations, predictable behaviors, expected outcomes, a quiet sense of how this will eventually unfold. So when the person does something neutral, your mind doesn't process it in isolation. It compares it. Does this match the pattern? Does this confirm what I already think? And most of the time, it finds a way to make it fit. A simple sentence can feel loaded. A normal delay can feel intentional. A small shift in tone can feel like the beginning of something familiar. Not because it is, but because the mind is no longer seeing the moment clearly. It is aligning it with what it already expects. And once that alignment happens, your reactions begin changing. You might withdraw slightly, speak more carefully, hold back parts of yourself, or respond with tension that didn't exist before. From the outside, the other person only sees the change in you. They don't see the pattern your mind is reacting to. They don't see the history being projected into the moment. So your behavior begins to feel confusing to them, unclear, unexpected. And in response, they begin adjusting. Maybe they pull back. Maybe they become less expressive. Maybe they start responding with their own form of caution. Not because of who they are, but because of how the interaction now feels. This is where something important begins to happen. The pattern you recognized starts becoming visible. Not because it was there from the beginning, but because the interaction has slowly shaped itself around it. Your reactions influenced their responses. Their responses reinforced your expectations, and the cycle continues. Until the person in front of you begins to resemble the pattern your mind first identified. And when that resemblance becomes clear, it feels like confirmation. This is who they are. This is how this always goes. But what often remains unseen is how little of that pattern belonged to them at the start, and how much of it was quietly shaped by the way your mind chose to relate to them. Over time, the pattern stops feeling like a possibility and starts feeling like truth. You no longer question it. You don't pause to consider where it came from. It feels obvious. This is just how people are. This is just how this always ends. And that sense of certainty becomes stable. The mind prefers stability, even if the stability is built on something inaccurate, because once a pattern feels familiar, it becomes easier to trust than the unknown. So the mind continues using it, again and again, across different people, across different situations, which is why similar emotional outcomes begin repeating, not because the same type of person keeps appearing, but because the same internal pattern keeps being applied. Different faces, different personalities, different circumstances, but the interpretation feels the same. The expectation forms the same way. The reaction follows the same path. And eventually, the ending feels familiar too. Distance, tension, disconnection, a quiet sense that something went wrong, again. And the mind explains it in a way that feels consistent. This always happens. People are like this. But what often remains unexamined is how early the pattern entered the interaction, how quickly the mind moved from observing to predicting, how subtly expectation began shaping behavior, and how that behavior influenced the other person in return. From the inside, it feels like the world keeps repeating itself, the same outcomes, the same disappointments, the same emotional conclusions. But from another angle, it is the same internal lens being applied again and again. The pattern feels external, like something you keep encountering, but it often begins internally, quietly, before the person in front of you has fully had the chance to be seen. This is why familiarity can feel so convincing, because it reduces uncertainty. It creates a sense of knowing, even when that knowing is built from something incomplete. And once the mind feels certain, it stops looking closely. It stops questioning. It stops noticing the differences that don't fit the pattern. Until eventually, new people begin to feel like familiar outcomes. If this perspective felt familiar, consider liking the video and subscribing. Two people can live through the same moment and walk away with different realities. You assume that misunderstanding happens because someone failed to listen carefully enough, or because someone explained themselves poorly, or because emotions got in the way. But most of the time, none of that is the real cause. Misunderstanding is not a breakdown in communication. It is the default condition of two separate minds trying to interpret the same moment. When something happens between you and another person, the event itself is actually the smallest part of what gets experienced. The words spoken, the tone used, the expression on a face. These are only signals. They are not the meaning. The meaning is constructed afterward, inside each mind. Your mind does not simply hear words and store them. It immediately begins interpreting them. It searches for patterns it already knows. It compares the moment to past experiences. It asks silent questions without you even noticing. What does this remind me of? What usually happens next in situations like this? Is this safe? Is this rejection? Is this approval? The answers appear instantly, and once they appear, they feel like facts. But those answers are not facts. They are interpretations built from memory. And every mind carries a different memory library, different histories, different insecurities, different expectations of what certain behaviors mean, which means the moment is not being processed through the same system, not even close. Imagine two people sitting in the same conversation. One person hears a pause before the other responds. To one mind, that pause feels neutral, just thinking. But to another mind, that same pause triggers something older, a memory of being ignored, of being dismissed, of waiting for people who never cared enough to answer. So the pause stops being neutral. It becomes a signal that something is wrong. The other person may not even realize a pause occurred. To them, the moment continues normally. But in the second mind, the meaning has already changed. Silence becomes distance. Distance becomes rejection. And rejection becomes emotional certainty. From that point forward, both people are still in the same conversation, but they are no longer inside the same moment. They are responding to two different realities, one built from what just happened, the other built from what that moment reminded the mind of. And once those realities split, everything that follows begins to drift further apart, because the mind rarely questions the interpretations it generates. It trusts them. They feel immediate. They feel obvious. They feel like the only reasonable explanation for what just occurred. So when you respond emotionally, you are not reacting to the event. You are reacting to the meaning your mind constructed around it. The other person is doing the exact same thing, but using a completely different internal map. Different memories, different sensitivities, different expectations about how people behave when they care or when they don't. Which means that long before either of you speak again, two separate stories have already been written, inside two separate minds, about the same moment. And from that point forward, both people begin responding to stories the other person never actually experienced. You believe you are reacting to what someone did. But most of the time, you are reacting to what your mind concluded it meant. The difference between those two things is small enough to go unnoticed, but large enough to change the entire direction of a relationship. When another person speaks to you, your mind does not simply receive the information and wait. It begins interpreting immediately, before the sentence even finishes, before the tone fully settles, before the moment has had time to exist on its own. Your mind moves ahead of the event, and it starts building meaning, not from the present, from the past. Every mind carries a collection of unfinished emotional patterns, moments that were never fully understood, rejections that were never explained, silences that once meant something painful. And those patterns do not stay in the past, they stay active, waiting for signals that resemble what happened before. So when something small appears, a delayed reply, a different tone, a sentence that feels slightly colder than usual, the mind does not treat it as a new event. It treats it as a continuation of something older. It connects the signal to a pattern it already recognizes, and the moment stops being neutral. This is why two people can hear the same words and experience completely different emotional reactions, because they are not reacting to the same internal meaning. One mind hears a simple statement, another hears a warning. One hears honesty, another hears criticism. The words themselves are identical, but the internal context is not. Once that interpretation forms, it becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Your tone changes. Your posture shifts. Your next response carries emotion that did not exist seconds earlier, and the other person notices. But they are not seeing the interpretation that caused the shift. They are only seeing the shift itself. So now they begin interpreting you. Why did their tone change? Why did they suddenly sound distant? Why does this feel tense now? Their mind begins its own pattern search, its own comparison to past moments, its own quiet construction of meaning. And just like that, a new layer is added to the situation. Not because anything objective changed, but because both minds are now responding to interpretations the other person cannot see. Each response begins shaping the next interpretation. Tone becomes evidence. Silence becomes confirmation. small changes in behavior begin to feel intentional. This is how misunderstanding grows without anyone noticing. No one is lying. No one is trying to manipulate the situation. No one even realizes that the moment has already shifted. Both people believe they are responding to what is actually happening. But in reality, they are responding to meanings that only exist inside their own mind. And because those meanings feel obvious, they are rarely questioned. The mind assumes it has seen the situation clearly, that its interpretation must be the correct one, that the emotional reaction now unfolding is justified. But the other mind is doing the exact same thing, using a different pattern, a different memory, a different emotional history. So the moment that once belonged to both people quietly splits into two internal realities, each one logical from the inside, each one convincing, each one built from pieces the other person cannot see. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Once two minds begin constructing different meanings, the conversation is no longer about the moment itself. It becomes about protecting the interpretation each mind has already chosen. And the mind does this quietly, without announcing it, without even realizing it is happening. When your mind settles on a meaning, it does something subtle. It begins searching for confirmation. Not understanding, confirmation. Small details start to feel like evidence. A tone that sounds slightly colder. A reply that feels shorter than usual. A facial expression that seems distant for a moment. The mind collects these signals and places them beside the interpretation it already formed. And each new signal strengthens the story. This process feels like clarity. It feels like you are beginning to see the situation more accurately. But what is actually happening is something else. Your mind is slowly building a case explaining why your interpretation must be correct. Meanwhile, the other person is doing the same thing, but from the opposite direction. They notice your reactions, your hesitation, your shift in tone, your silence, and their mind begins building its own explanation. Why are they acting this way? Why did their energy change? What does this mean about how they feel? And just like that, two internal investigations are happening at the same time. Neither person realizes that the evidence they are collecting is already shaped by interpretation. Because once the mind decides what something means, it begins filtering the moment through that decision. Signals that support the story become highly visible. Signals that contradict it fade into the background. The mind is not trying to lie. It is trying to stabilize the story it already believes. This is why misunderstandings often feel so convincing. Both people feel certain. Both feel that the situation has become obvious. Both feel that the other person's behavior clearly reveals what is happening. But what feels obvious is often just the result of the mind protecting its own interpretation. At this point, the original moment is already far behind. What remains now is the reaction, the tension, the subtle distance that begins appearing between responses. And neither person fully understands where it came from, because from the inside, everything still feels logical. Your reaction makes sense to you. Their reaction makes sense to them. Each mind sees its interpretation as a reasonable response to the situation. But the two interpretations were built from different internal histories, different expectations, different emotional references. So the conflict that appears later is rarely about the moment people think it started with. It is about the meanings that were quietly constructed before anyone noticed the shift. Two people can spend hours trying to resolve a disagreement without realizing they are arguing from two entirely different versions of what actually happened. And the more they try to defend their version of the moment, the more real that version becomes inside their mind. Because every explanation they give, every memory they reference, every signal they point to, tightens the structure of the story they already believe, until eventually, both people are no longer discussing the same reality at all. By the time people try to resolve a misunderstanding, the moment itself is already gone. What remains are the interpretations that grew from it, and those interpretations now feel real. Not like guesses, not like possibilities, like facts. Each person begins explaining what happened, but what they describe is not the same moment. It is the version their mind constructed, the version shaped by past patterns, emotional sensitivities, and expectations about what certain behaviors mean. So when one person says, "You ignored me," they are not describing the silence itself, they are describing the meaning their mind gave to that silence. The other person hears the accusation and feels confused, because from their perspective, nothing like that occurred. They were thinking, they were distracted, they were choosing their words carefully. But none of those internal states were visible, so the moment they experienced does not match the one being described. This is why explanations often make misunderstandings worse instead of better, because each explanation strengthens the interpretation behind it. When you explain your reaction, you naturally gather the pieces that support it. The tone you remember, the pause that felt significant, the look that seemed distant. All of it reinforces the internal story, and the more clearly you explain it, the more certain it begins to feel. The other person does the same thing. They explain their intention. They describe what they were actually thinking. They point to moments that contradict the accusation. But those signals were not part of the interpretation that formed earlier. So they struggle to change a meaning that has already stabilized. This is the quiet difficulty of human communication. Not that people lie, not that they refuse to listen, but that the mind builds meaning so quickly and trusts it so completely, long before clarification becomes possible. And once a meaning settles inside the mind, it begins shaping everything that follows. What you notice, what you remember, what you expect the other person to do next. The mind quietly organizes the world around the interpretation it has already chosen, which is why two people can sincerely believe they are describing the same moment while standing inside completely different realities. Misunderstanding is not rare. It is not unusual. It is not a failure of communication. It is the natural result of two minds interpreting signals through different histories, different fears, different expectations about what certain behaviors mean. The moment itself is brief, but the meanings built around it can last much longer, because once the mind decides what something meant, it begins protecting that meaning, quietly, automatically, without announcing it. Which is why the most difficult part of understanding another person is not hearing their words. It is recognizing that the meaning you felt so certain about may have been constructed inside your own mind. If you found this perspective useful, consider liking the video and subscribing. Silence rarely stays silent in the mind. The moment words disappear, interpretation begins. A message is not answered. A conversation pauses. Someone reads a sentence and does not respond. Nothing has actually happened, but the mind begins reacting as if something did, because silence does not feel neutral. It feels incomplete. The brain is built to organize information, to connect signals, to construct explanations. Silence interrupts that process. It creates an empty space where explanation should be. and the mind does not like empty spaces. Unanswered moments introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty quietly activates the search for meaning. The brain begins asking a silent question. What does this silence mean? Are they ignoring me? Are they upset? Did I say something wrong? The moment remains quiet, but the mind is already constructing possibilities. Not because the silence contained those meanings, because the brain cannot leave the moment undefined. In social situations especially, silence becomes powerful. Human interaction normally flows with signals, words, expressions, responses. Each signal helps the brain understand the situation. Silence removes those signals, and without signals, the mind begins inventing them. A delayed reply begins feeling intentional. A quiet room begins feeling tense. A pause begins feeling like judgment. The absence of information becomes information, not because silence communicates clearly, but because the mind refuses to leave it blank. Meaning begins filling the space. The brain searches memory, past conversations, past conflicts, past rejections. Anything that resembles the moment. Those memories begin shaping the explanation. If silence once meant rejection, it begins meaning rejection again. If silence once followed conflict, it begins suggesting conflict again. The interpretation forms quickly, and once it forms, emotion begins responding to it. An unanswered message becomes distance. A pause becomes disapproval. The body reacts to the interpretation. Tension appears. Attention narrows, all from a moment that contained no clear message at all. This is the quiet power of silence. It invites the mind to explain it, and the explanation often arrives before the facts. The person may simply be busy, or distracted, or thinking about something else entirely, but the mind rarely waits long enough to discover that. The narrative already formed, the interpretation already appeared, and once meaning fills the silence, the moment no longer feels empty. It feels defined, even though the definition was quietly created inside the observer, not inside the silence itself. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Once silence appears, the mind rarely waits for explanation. It begins building one. A message remains unanswered. Minutes pass, then more time passes. Nothing new has happened, but the mind is already active. It begins filling the empty space, quietly constructing a narrative. Maybe they're annoyed. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe something went wrong. Each possibility begins forming an explanation for the silence, and the brain naturally gravitates toward explanations that feel emotionally familiar, not necessarily accurate, just familiar. If someone has experienced rejection before, silence begins resembling rejection. If someone has experienced criticism before, silence begins resembling disapproval. Past emotional patterns begin shaping the story. The mind rarely starts from zero. It searches memory for similar moments. Times when silence followed tension. Times when silence preceded distance. Times when silence meant something painful. Those memories quietly guide interpretation. The brain connects the present moment with the past, and the explanation begins feeling convincing because it resembles something the mind already understands. This is why silence often becomes emotionally loaded, not because silence itself contains emotion, but because memory adds it. The narrative grows quietly. A delayed reply becomes intentional. A pause becomes avoidance. A lack of words becomes a hidden message. Soon the mind is no longer experiencing silence. It is experiencing a story explaining what the silence supposedly means. And once the story forms, emotion begins responding to it. Anxiety appears. Defensiveness appears. Sadness appears. The emotional reaction feels justified because the narrative feels real. But the narrative was constructed from fragments of memory, fragments of expectation, fragments of fear. The silence itself never provided those meanings. The mind supplied them. This happens so quickly that it rarely feels like imagination. It feels like recognition, as if the silence clearly communicated something, when in reality, the brain simply refused to leave it undefined. Meaning filled the gap. And once the gap was filled, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, even though the intention may have existed only in the story the mind created. Silence becomes powerful because the mind rarely recognizes what it is doing. It believes it is reading the moment, when it is actually writing the meaning of the moment. The silence itself remains unchanged. No words, no signal, no confirmation. But the mind quietly constructs a narrative around that absence. And once the narrative appears, the emotional response begins. The story feels like information. The interpretation feels like perception, as if the silence clearly communicated something. But silence rarely communicates clearly. It simply leaves space, and the mind fills that space with explanation. Once that process becomes visible, something subtle begins shifting. The silence stops feeling as certain. The story surrounding it begins loosening. A different question appears. Is this meaning coming from the silence, or from my mind's need to explain it? That question creates distance. The moment slows down. The interpretation becomes less automatic. Silence returns to what it actually was: an absence of information, not confirmation, not rejection, not judgment, just absence. The mind may still suggest explanations, but they begin looking like possibilities, not conclusions. The story loses some of its authority. Emotion softens, because the certainty around the silence begins fading. The mind is no longer reacting to a narrative it fully believes. It is observing the space more carefully. And sometimes, that space truly contains nothing at all. No hidden message, no intention, no judgment, only the absence of information. But the brain rarely tolerates that absence easily, which is why silence so quickly becomes a psychological story, a narrative constructed to stabilize uncertainty, a meaning placed inside the gap, even when the silence itself never contained it. If this perspective resonated, consider liking the video and subscribing, not to eliminate silence, but to notice how quickly the mind begins filling it with meaning. You don't need to know what actually happened. You need something that explains it. When something feels unclear, incomplete, or difficult to interpret, your mind does not stay open. It does not hold the gap. It does not wait. It moves. And the direction it moves in is not toward truth, it moves toward coherence. The brain is not designed to prioritize accuracy first. It is designed to create stability, to build a version of reality that feels connected, continuous, and understandable. Because uncertainty creates a kind of internal tension. Too many possibilities begin to exist at once. Too many outcomes feel possible. Too many interpretations compete without resolution. And the mind does not tolerate that state for long, so it reduces it. Not by investigating everything fully, not by gathering all available information, but by filling the gap. If someone becomes distant, your mind does not remain in the question. It does not sit with, "I don't know why." It begins constructing an explanation. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe this is how it always begins. None of these explanations are verified. None of them are complete. But they are coherent. They connect the moment to a cause. They create a sense of direction. They turn uncertainty into something structured. And once that structure forms, the mind relaxes, because now the moment feels understood, even if it isn't. This is the quiet trade the mind makes. It chooses a believable explanation over an accurate one, because belief stabilizes, uncertainty does not. A complete story gives you something to hold, something to respond to, something to organize your behavior around. It tells you what this means, what might happen next, how you should feel about it. An incomplete moment offers none of that. It leaves you suspended, without clarity, without direction, without resolution. And the mind experiences that as discomfort. So instead of remaining open, it closes the gap, quickly, automatically, almost invisibly, from not knowing to believing. And that shift feels like understanding, like you've figured something out, like the situation has become clear. But what actually happened is simpler. The mind reached the point where it could no longer tolerate uncertainty and replaced it with a story that made sense. A story that feels complete, even when parts of it were never truly known. You don't notice when the story forms. You only notice when it starts to feel true. The moment something is unclear, your mind doesn't pause and label it as incomplete. It begins resolving it, quietly, automatically. And the way it resolves it is not through careful investigation. It resolves it through completion. The brain treats missing information like an error, like something unfinished, something that needs to be closed before you can move forward. So when a gap appears, it doesn't stay empty. It gets filled. Not with confirmed truth, but with the most accessible explanation, the one that connects fastest, the one that fits most easily with what you already believe. If someone's behavior doesn't fully make sense, your mind doesn't keep it open. It doesn't say, "There are too many variables here." It simplifies, it selects, it creates a reason. Maybe they're pulling away. Maybe they're upset. Maybe they've lost interest. These explanations appear quickly because they are familiar. They match patterns you've already seen. They require less effort to construct. And because they arrive quickly, they feel natural. They don't feel like guesses. They feel like understanding. But speed is not accuracy. It's efficiency. The mind is not asking, "Is this explanation correct?" It is asking, "Does this explanation make sense?" And if it does, the process stops there. What often goes unnoticed is how much gets excluded in that moment. Other possibilities, other interpretations, other explanations that don't fit as easily. They don't disappear, They just become less visible. Because once a story begins forming, the mind starts organizing everything around it. Details that support it stand out. Details that challenge it fade. The explanation becomes a filter, not just a conclusion. And from that point forward, you're no longer observing the situation. You're observing your interpretation of it, a version that already feels resolved, already feels understood. This is why misunderstandings don't feel uncertain. They feel clear. They feel obvious. They feel like something you've already figured out, even when key pieces were never actually known, because the discomfort of not knowing was replaced too quickly, before the moment had time to unfold fully, before more information could appear, before the situation could define itself. The gap was closed. And once the gap is closed, the mind rarely reopens it. It moves forward with the explanation it created, responds to it, builds on it. And what began as an incomplete moment becomes a complete story, one that feels stable, even if it was built too quickly to be true. If this perspective resonates, like the video. Subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. Once a story feels coherent, it stops feeling like a story. It starts feeling like reality. You don't experience it as something your mind created. You experience it as something you discovered, as if the situation revealed itself clearly, as if the meaning was always there, waiting to be seen. But what actually happened is quieter. The mind reached a version that made sense and decided it was enough. The brain doesn't measure truth the way you think it does. It doesn't constantly compare your interpretation to objective reality. It evaluates something else: consistency, familiarity, emotional alignment. If a story fits with what you already believe, if it aligns with past experiences, if it explains the moment in a way that feels internally stable, it gets accepted. Not because it is verified, but because it is coherent. This is why believable explanations feel so convincing. They don't have to be accurate. They just have to connect. They have to form a clean line between cause and effect. They have to feel like something you've seen before. If someone becomes distant and your mind explains it as rejection, that explanation doesn't need evidence to feel real. It only needs to match something familiar, a past moment, a previous outcome, a pattern your mind already trusts. And once that match happens, the explanation stabilizes. It begins to feel obvious. This is where something subtle shifts. You stop questioning the story. You stop looking for alternatives. You stop considering that the situation might be more complex than it appears. Because questioning would reopen uncertainty, and the mind already moved past that. It already closed the gap. So instead of asking, "What else could this mean?" you begin asking, "What confirms what I already think?" And that question changes everything. Your attention starts narrowing. Details that support the explanation become clearer. They stand out. They feel important. Details that don't fit become less noticeable, less relevant, easier to dismiss. The story is no longer just an explanation. It becomes a filter, a way of organizing everything you see next. And because the story continues to feel consistent, it continues to feel true. Not because it has been tested, but because it hasn't been challenged. This is why two people can look at the same situation and feel equally certain about completely different meanings. Each mind has built a story that fits its own internal logic, its own history, its own expectations. And within that internal system, the story holds together. It feels stable. It feels complete, even when it was never fully examined. Because once something feels coherent, the mind stops asking if it's true and starts treating it as if it is. Once a story fits, the mind begins protecting it. Not aggressively, not intentionally, but quietly, automatically. Because the story is no longer just about what happened. It becomes part of how you understand people, how you understand situations, how you understand yourself. And once something connects to identity, it becomes harder to question. The mind doesn't just prefer coherent stories, it depends on them. They create continuity. They make the world feel structured. They give you a sense that things follow patterns you can recognize. Without that, everything feels unpredictable, unstable, open in a way that has no clear direction. So when a story settles, the mind reinforces it. It remembers moments that support it more clearly. It recalls details that fit the explanation. It repeats the narrative internally until it feels solid. And over time, the story becomes easier to access, easier to believe, easier to return to in similar situations, until it starts shaping how you see things before they even fully happen. This is where the story moves from explanation to framework. You don't just use it to understand one moment. You begin using it to interpret future ones. If your mind decided that distance means rejection, that story doesn't stay in one interaction. It carries forward. It applies itself again and again, across different people, across different situations. And each time it appears, it feels more true. Not because it has been proven, but because it has been repeated. This is how inaccurate stories become stable, not through evidence, but through familiarity. The more often the mind uses them, the less it questions them. And when something challenges the story, the mind doesn't easily let it in. It resists, it reframes, it explains it away. Because accepting a different explanation would do more than change one moment. It would reopen uncertainty. It would disrupt the structure the mind has built. And the mind avoids that. So the story remains, even when parts of it don't fully hold, even when something doesn't quite fit, because it still feels more stable than starting over. This is why people can hold on to explanations that don't fully align with reality, not because they are unwilling to see differently, but because the story they have already makes sense, and sense feels safer than uncertainty. From the inside, it doesn't feel like holding on to something inaccurate. It feels like understanding the world clearly, like seeing patterns, like recognizing how things work. But what feels like clarity is often just coherence, a story that holds together, even when parts of it were never fully true. If this perspective made something clearer, consider liking the video and subscribing. You don't see people as they are. You see what you can manage. Every person you meet carries more complexity than your mind can hold at once. Contradictions, shifts in behavior, inconsistencies in tone, moments that don't align, patterns that don't fully connect. There is no clean version of a person that exists in reality, only fragments, changing ones. But the mind does not function well with fragments. It doesn't sit comfortably in uncertainty. It doesn't like holding multiple possibilities at the same time. So, instead of keeping that complexity intact, it begins to compress it, not as a conscious decision, not as something you choose to do, but as a natural response to overload. The brain simplifies because it has to. It reduces because it cannot process everything equally. It takes what is scattered and turns it into something stable. And the easiest way to create stability is to categorize, to take a person with shifting behavior and assign them something fixed, something predictable, something that can be understood quickly. So instead of holding the full range of who someone is, the mind narrows it down. They become distant, or reliable, or selfish, or kind. A single trait begins to stand in for a complex system of behavior. This simplification feels natural. It feels efficient. It gives you something to work with, a way to anticipate, a way to respond without needing to reevaluate every moment from the beginning. But what gets lost in that process is everything that doesn't fit cleanly into the category, the moments that contradict it, the behaviors that don't align, the parts of the person that exist outside of the label. And those parts don't disappear. They just stop being integrated into how you see them. So when they act in a way that fits the category, it feels consistent, expected, confirming. But when they act outside of it, it feels like an exception, something temporary, something that doesn't define who they are. This is how a complex person becomes a simplified idea, not because they lack depth, but because your mind cannot hold that depth in real time. And once that simplification forms, it becomes the version of them that you carry forward, the version you respond to, the version you anticipate, even though it was never complete. This is not about misunderstanding one moment. It's about reducing many moments into something that feels stable enough to hold, something that doesn't require constant adjustment, because constant adjustment feels like uncertainty, and uncertainty is something the mind is always trying to avoid. So it replaces complexity with clarity, even if that clarity is incomplete, even if that clarity removes parts of the person that were always there. And once that simplified version forms, it becomes easier to hold than the truth ever was. Once a label forms, you stop meeting the person. The moment your mind assigns a category, something subtle shifts. You no longer approach the person directly. You approach the label you've created for them. And that label begins to sit between you and everything they do. If someone becomes difficult, their behavior starts being interpreted through that frame. A neutral comment feels sharper. A small disagreement feels intentional. A moment of silence feels loaded. The label begins shaping the meaning before the moment is even fully processed. At the same time, anything that contradicts the label doesn't get the same attention. It doesn't carry the same weight. If they show patience, it feels temporary. If they show care, it feels like an exception. The mind doesn't reject these moments completely. It just refuses to let them redefine the category. Because the label is not just a description, it's a structure. It organizes perception. It tells the mind what to expect, what to notice, and what to ignore. And once that structure is in place, the brain starts relying on it instead of observing from scratch. This is where observation quietly gets replaced. You're no longer watching behavior as it unfolds. You're matching behavior to what you've already decided it means. The process becomes faster, but also narrower. You don't need to evaluate each moment fully anymore. The label does part of the work for you. It fills in gaps. It predicts intent. It reduces the effort required to understand what's happening. But that efficiency comes at a cost, because the label is not flexible. It resists change. It resists contradiction. And over time, it becomes harder for new information to enter without being reshaped to fit. So when the person behaves differently, you don't experience it as new data. You experience it as something that needs to be explained within the existing frame. A kind action becomes out of character. A thoughtful response becomes unexpected. The behavior is acknowledged, but it's not integrated. It's treated as something separate from who they are. This is how labels maintain themselves, not by rejecting reality completely, but by reorganizing it, by placing everything into positions that don't threaten the original category. And as that continues, the distance between the person and the label grows. The label becomes more stable than the person themselves, more consistent, more predictable. So you stop adjusting your understanding based on what you see. You adjust what you see based on what you already understand. And from your perspective, it feels accurate. It feels grounded. It feels like you've learned who they are. But what you've learned is not the person in full. It's the simplified version your mind can hold without needing to constantly reevaluate. And once that version takes over, it becomes the lens through which everything else is interpreted. Not because the person stopped changing, but because your perception of them stopped updating. And what stops updating slowly begins to feel like something fixed. If this perspective resonates, like the video, subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. Once someone is simplified, their behavior stops being seen clearly. After a label takes hold, it doesn't just influence what you notice. It begins shaping how you interpret everything that follows. Behavior is no longer taken at face value, it is filtered, adjusted, reframed, so it aligns with what you already believe. If someone has been reduced to selfish, their actions are read through that assumption. If they take space, it feels intentional. If they prioritize something else, it feels dismissive. Even neutral decisions begin to carry meaning that fits the label. But if that same person acts with care, it doesn't register in the same way. It feels inconsistent, temporary, something that doesn't redefine the overall impression. The mind accepts the behavior, but it doesn't let it change the structure it has already built. This is where distortion begins, not in what happens, but in how it is understood. The same action can be interpreted in completely different ways depending on the category assigned to the person. A delayed response can be seen as disinterest or as being overwhelmed. Silence can be read as avoidance or as processing. Distance can feel like rejection or like uncertainty. The behavior itself stays the same. The meaning shifts based on the lens. And once that lens is fixed, interpretation stops being flexible. You don't move between possibilities. You stay within the one that matches what you've already concluded. This is how nuance disappears, not because it isn't there, but because it no longer has a place in how the mind organizes the person. Complexity becomes inconvenient. Contradiction becomes something to resolve rather than something to understand. So instead of holding multiple explanations at once, the mind settles on one and keeps reinforcing it. It chooses the version that feels most consistent, even if it's incomplete. Over time, this changes how you respond. You begin reacting not to what is happening, but to what you believe it represents. Your tone shifts, your expectations narrow, your reactions become more predictable because they are tied to a fixed interpretation. And the other person begins responding to that, sometimes by matching it, sometimes by withdrawing, sometimes by becoming more aligned with the version you already hold of them, which makes the distortion harder to detect because their behavior starts to resemble what you expected from the beginning, not necessarily because that's who they are, but because the interaction has been shaped in that direction. So the gap between who they are and how they are seen continues to widen, quietly, gradually, without a clear moment where it shifts. And from the inside, it doesn't feel like distortion. It feels like understanding. It feels like you've learned how they operate. But what you've learned is a pattern built from selective interpretation, a version that fits cleanly, even if it leaves parts out. And once that version stabilizes, it becomes difficult to see anything outside of it. Not because the person stopped being complex, but because the mind stopped allowing that complexity to remain visible. And what isn't allowed to remain visible slowly begins to feel like it was never there. The simplified version feels real because it stays consistent. Once the mind reduces someone into a stable category, something settles. The unpredictability decreases. The need to constantly reassess fades. You no longer feel like you're dealing with something shifting. You feel like you understand what you're dealing with. And that feeling matters, because the brain doesn't just seek accuracy, it seeks stability. It prefers something that makes sense over something that requires constant adjustment, even if that sense is built on a limited view. A simplified version of a person provides that stability. It gives you a fixed reference point, a way to anticipate their behavior, a way to respond without hesitation. It removes the need to stay open to multiple interpretations. And over time, that stability starts to feel like truth. Not because it captures the full complexity of who they are, but because it remains consistent across your perception. It doesn't shift. It doesn't challenge you. It reinforces itself. Every time their behavior aligns with the label, the belief strengthens. Every time something contradicts it, it gets minimized, explained, or set aside. The structure remains intact. So what you experience is not a balanced view of the person. It's a reinforced version, one that has been shaped, filtered, and stabilized over time. And because it feels stable, it feels safe. It removes ambiguity. It gives you a sense of control over how you interpret what happens next. But that safety comes from reduction, from compressing something complex into something manageable, from choosing consistency over completeness. The more stable the perception becomes, the harder it is to question. Not because it's perfectly accurate, but because it no longer creates friction. It fits smoothly into how you understand the person. And once something fits smoothly, it stops being examined. It stops being challenged. It becomes the default. This is how simplified views sustain themselves. They don't need to be fully correct. They only need to remain consistent enough to avoid disruption. So the mind keeps returning to the same version, the same interpretation, the same structure, because it requires less effort than rebuilding understanding from the ground up. And from your perspective, it feels like clarity, like you've figured them out, like you see them for who they are. But what feels like clarity is often just coherence, a version that holds together without contradiction, even if parts of reality were left out to make it work. And once coherence replaces complexity, the person becomes easier to hold in your mind, but harder to actually see. If this made something clearer than it was before, consider liking the video and subscribing. You don't notice everything. You notice what agrees with you. The moment a belief forms, attention begins to reorganize itself around it. Not in a way you can feel happening, not in a way you consciously direct. It shifts quietly, automatically. The brain is not designed to observe reality in a neutral, balanced way. It is designed to reduce it, to compress it, to take something overwhelming and make it manageable. And the way it does that is by filtering what it lets through. If you start to believe someone is distant, attention begins narrowing toward that idea. You notice the pauses in their responses, the slight hesitation in their tone, the way they don't hold eye contact as long as you expect. These details begin to stand out, They feel sharper, more visible, more important. Not because they objectively dominate the interaction, but because your mind has already decided they matter. At the same time, everything that contradicts that belief begins to lose weight. The moments they showed interest, the times they reached out first, the signals that suggest warmth or presence don't disappear. They just stop holding your attention. They pass through without being stored, without being emphasized, without being used to shape your understanding. This is how attention works. It does not treat all information equally. It selects based on relevance. And relevance is not determined by accuracy. It is determined by consistency with what you already believe. The mind is not asking, "What is actually happening here?" It is asking something quieter, something faster. What fits what I already know? And once that question becomes the filter, perception begins to narrow without you realizing it. You feel like you're observing clearly. You feel like you're picking up on real signals. But what you're actually experiencing is selection, a quiet prioritization of certain details over others. This is why two people can exist in the same moment and leave with completely different interpretations. One person notices tension. Another notices uncertainty. One sees rejection. Another sees distraction. The moment itself does not change. The data is the same. But what gets selected from that data is different. And once something is selected, it doesn't feel like a possibility. It feels like the truth. It feels obvious. It feels grounded in what you've seen. Because from your perspective, the evidence is right there. You've noticed it. You've felt it. You've tracked it. But what you've tracked is not everything. It's only what your attention allowed through. The rest was present, but it was not prioritized, not reinforced, not given meaning. Over time, this creates a pattern that begins to stabilize itself. The more you notice what confirms your belief, the more that belief feels accurate. The more accurate it feels, the more your attention continues selecting the same type of evidence. It becomes a loop, quiet, continuous, self-reinforcing. You don't feel like you're filtering reality, you feel like you're seeing it clearly. But clarity in this case is not coming from completeness. It's coming from consistency. The same type of signals, noticed repeatedly, begin to feel like the full picture. And what gets repeated in your attention slowly becomes what feels true, even when it was never the whole of what was there. If this made you pause, like the video. Subscribe if you want to keep observing. What confirms your view doesn't just get noticed. It feels more real. Once attention begins selecting certain details, something more subtle happens. Those details don't just appear more often, they start to feel heavier, more meaningful, more representative of the situation as a whole. The mind doesn't label them as selected, it treats them as evidence. If you believe someone is losing interest, every delayed response begins to carry weight. It doesn't feel like one small moment. It feels like a signal, a pattern, a confirmation. The brain connects it to what you already suspect and strengthens the link. At the same time, anything that contradicts that belief doesn't just get ignored, it gets explained away, reinterpreted, reduced. A kind message becomes politeness. A moment of presence becomes temporary. A clear signal becomes something uncertain. This is where perception becomes less about observation and more about preservation. The mind is not only selecting what fits, it is protecting the coherence of what it has already built. Anything that threatens that coherence is quietly reshaped until it no longer feels like a threat. So instead of asking, "Does this change what I believe?" the mind leans toward a different question. How can this fit into what I already believe? And with that shift, interpretation begins to bend. You start assigning meaning in a way that maintains internal consistency, not because you're trying to be biased, but because the brain prefers a stable story over an accurate one. Stability reduces uncertainty. It creates a sense of control, even if that control is built on incomplete perception. This is why confirming details feel stronger. They don't just align with your belief, they reinforce it. They give it structure. They give it continuity. Each new confirming signal feels like proof that what you thought was right all along. And over time, those signals begin to carry more weight than they should. A small behavior becomes a defining trait. A single moment becomes representative of the whole person. The mind begins generalizing, expanding, filling in gaps with assumptions that feel justified. Meanwhile, contradictory details never get the same chance. They remain isolated, unconnected. They don't build momentum. They don't accumulate into something meaningful because attention never stays on them long enough. So the balance between confirming and contradicting evidence is not equal. It never was. One side is being reinforced, the other is being quietly weakened. And because of that imbalance, your perception starts to feel increasingly certain, not because you've seen everything, but because what you've seen keeps pointing in the same direction. Certainty in this case is not built from completeness, it's built from repetition. The same type of signal, noticed again and again, begins to feel like undeniable truth. And once something feels undeniable, you stop questioning it. You stop looking for alternatives. You stop noticing anything that doesn't align. Not because you've made a decision to ignore it, but because your attention no longer moves toward it. This is how perception becomes weighted. Not by what is objectively most important, but by what has been consistently selected, reinforced, and given meaning. And once that weighting settles, what you believe no longer feels like an interpretation. It feels like reality itself. What you keep noticing eventually becomes what you believe is always there. Over time, selective attention doesn't just shape what you see in a moment. It builds a pattern across moments. A pattern that begins to feel stable, predictable, familiar. The mind starts recognizing the same signals over and over, and because those signals are consistently selected, they begin to feel like the underlying truth of the situation. If you've been noticing distance, that distance starts to feel like a constant. Not something that appears occasionally, but something that defines the other person. If you've been noticing rejection, it begins to feel like an ongoing reality rather than a series of isolated moments. This is where belief stops feeling like a conclusion and starts feeling like a fact. You're no longer thinking, "I think this is happening." You're experiencing, "This is what's happening." The uncertainty disappears, not because it was resolved, but because it was filtered out. And once something feels like a fact, you begin interacting with it differently. Your tone shifts. Your expectations shift. Your behavior adjusts to match what you now assume is true. You respond to the version of reality your attention has constructed. This is where the loop completes itself. Because your behavior, shaped by that belief, begins to influence the other person. They respond to you differently, sometimes more distant, sometimes more guarded, sometimes more uncertain. And when they do, it looks like confirmation. It feels like proof that what you believed from the beginning was accurate. But what's actually happening is more subtle. You're not just observing a pattern, you're participating in it. Your attention selected certain signals. Your interpretation gave them meaning. Your behavior responded to that meaning, and that response shaped what came back to you. So the belief doesn't just stay inside your mind. It starts to influence the environment around you, quietly, gradually, until what you believe begins to look like what is happening. At that point, it becomes almost impossible to separate perception from reality, because the two have started to align. Not because the original belief was fully accurate, but because it has been consistently reinforced. This is how selective attention becomes a self-sustaining system. It doesn't need to be correct, it only needs to be consistent. As long as it keeps finding what fits, it continues to strengthen itself. And because it feels coherent, it feels safe. It removes ambiguity. It reduces uncertainty. It gives you a sense that you understand what's happening, even if that understanding is built on a narrow selection of reality. But the cost of that coherence is that everything outside of it becomes harder to see, harder to register, harder to believe, not because it isn't there, but because your attention is no longer moving toward it. So what you experience is not everything that exists in the moment. It's everything your mind has learned to keep noticing. And what your mind keeps noticing slowly becomes what feels true, stable, and unquestionable. Not because it is the full picture, but because it is the only part of the picture that has been consistently seen. If this made something clearer than it was before, consider liking the video and subscribing.